Urvashi Butalia, named it, right? So all the leading feminist scholars have delivered this lecture. This year is even more special because this year the center is celebrating its 25th anniversary. It was completed 25 years. The center was established in the year 2000 under the aegis of University Grants Commission, and ever since it has evolved, grown, prospered, and made very significant interventions in the area of feminist research and also gender sensitization programs and other kinds of events that the center has run. Center has made significant contribution. The center also has been running a journal which is a very important, considered very important journal in gender studies. It's called Women's Link. The center is named after Sarojini Naidu, and on 13th of February, we celebrate birth anniversary of Sarojini Naidu. And now that Professor Rita Kothari is delivering this annual memorial lecture on the 25th anniversary of the center, I think this is not an ordinary coincidence, because Sarojini Naidu combined politics and literature in her personality in unique ways. If you look at her politics, she talks about battle for India, and she was a very, very vocal speaker and vocal feminist. But if you read her poetry, very often it is dismissed as exotic, as mimicry, and mimicry of the British romantic models. She in fact began with a desire to be Keats of India, but once you read her poetry alongside her politics, you will realize that her ventriloquism actually, conceals a double-voiced discourse, which is very politically charged, and there is a need to go back and review and revisit her poetry in the light of her politics. So we have Professor Rita Kothari to deliver this lecture with us, and Rita's own journey. I mean, she has a glorious career, and as an academic, she has, she has made significant contribution and intervention in the field of translation studies, in the field of Indian literatures, and also our understanding of our knowledge systems, production of identity, and so on. Rita, in fact, I asked her for a bio note, and she gave a very modest kind of bio note, which is there on the poster and which you can read. But Rita's work actually extends far beyond what is there in the poster. She has published a large number of books, which include translations, her theoretical interventions on translation studies, and also a book that I really enjoy, which is called Memories and Movements, Borders and Communities in Banni, Kutch, Gujarat. Which I believe, coming from Rita, it is not a surprise, because after all, our lives are manifestations of translations, and being a translation scholar, she delves into these identities located on the interstitial spaces between India and Pakistan, post-partition India, and how those lives are impacted, and she also looks at the gender perspective of these women, working in this, Bani community. So Rita has, as I just mentioned, translated from Gujarati and Sindhi, and currently, she's translating from Sindhi into Hindi. So, she's very prolific. I won't read her resume, but, I will leave it to you to go out and explore her work and read her work. Then only you can truly appreciate the scope and the of her work and the significance of her work. So I welcome you, Professor Kothari. She's a friend also, so I tend to call her. So I'm very warm welcome to you. Once again to Jamia. You have been an old friend of Jamia, so yeah.
Thank you so much, Nisha, for that very warm introduction. And Nishad is quite right. I've been an old friend of Jamia. I may not physically come here that often, but for some reason, my life continues to intersect with Jamia students and Jamia faculty. And one of my friends said jokingly the other day, she said, Rita, wahin ghar le lo tum. So yes, it's a privilege, and I think of Jamia with a great deal of warmth. जो वो अपनापन होता है ना वो लगता है मुझे हाँ so thank you so much, and it's an honor, it's a privilege to be delivering this Sarojini Naidu Memorial Lecture. Before I actually begin to read out the talk, which is based on ethnographic work that I carried out in this region called Bani, which you will not find on a map. Maybe now you do, but at the time when I was working, even at the time when the book was published, Bani nahi thi maps pe. Interestingly, it is also the region where our beloved Prime Minister started what he called Ranotsav, the desert festival. And it's very interesting that the Gujarat state actually promoted the region as this sort of pride of Gujarat and its multiculturalism without actually knowing that the narratives of the region critique Gujarat the most. In the sense that, you know, the book has actually many interviews and people whom I write about, and the region is actually peopled by pastoralists, by cattle breeders, and who trace their legacy, who trace their ancestry to Sindh or sometimes to Balochistan and so on. But in the way the desert festival came to be, nobody is asking those pastoralists as to how do they see themselves. I mean, there is generally a lot of celebration around the handicrafts and the white desert and, you know, the camel ride and the embroidery of the region and so on. So I will come to the region shortly, but I also want to begin to actually first yeah. I want to begin, before I actually start like my formal talk, I also want to begin to complicate the idea of field work a little bit. Really speaking, the anthropological understanding of the field is that you go somewhere out there, right? You go to a small place, a village, a region where you do ethnographic work, and our understanding of the field, so to speak, almost always acquires a certain kind of physical realm, so to speak, and an externalization. But I do think that the field is constituted by the nature of inquiry we bring to it. And it does not have to be sort of so external, and it does not have to be a physical realm. Although in this particular case, I am talking about my field work not only with respect to women, but also in some sense guided by men in the region of Bani where I worked. But the reason why I'm actually prefacing this is to say that before I did this work, which is somewhat around 2008 to 2013, by the time I finished in 2013, the region had actually been put on the tourist map as desert festival and so forth. At the time when I started, it was a very, very unknown region, right? But even before this particular project, I want to go back to certain important moments in my own sort of a career as somebody who sort of reflects upon the questions of what are women's narratives about. I remember many, many years ago, before I had actually begun to write my work on the Sindhi experience of partition, which is one of my early monographs, a book called The Burden of Refuge. This came out in 2007, and it is actually, it sort of documents how, compared to the Punjabis and compared to the Bengalis, the Sindhi experience of partition, as in the fact that the Sindh is not divided into East Sindh and West Sindh, but the entire region goes to Pakistan. What were the processes of refugee rehabilitation of the Sindhi community when they came to the states of Gujarat and Rajasthan and Maharashtra and so on? So much before actually I started working on this, I remember taking an aunt of mine. I remember taking an aunt of mine to a homeopathic doctor, and this is like early 1990s. And this aunt of mine, now just to give you an idea, I come from that kind of family. I was asked just now if I was related to Rita Kothari. Now where do I even begin to tell you that actually I come from a family where nobody even goes to college. That I was the first person to go to college. So I wish I could say Rita Kothari mere chacha lagte the, lekin kuch nahi lagte hain mere. So I had taken this aunt of mine to the homeopathic doctor, and this aunt had something like 11 children. She must have married very much like my mother at the age of 12 or 13. My mother was also married by the time she was 14 years old. She had 11, 12 children, and she would talk about how every child, almost like, you know, मैं मटन बना रही थी और ये बच्चा पैदा हो गया, मैं फलां कर रही थी और वो बच्चा पैदा हो गया. There was a kind of about labor, a certain kind of a casualness and so forth. And I take her to a homeopath, and the homeopath, the doctor is Gujarati, and he's asking to my aunt, saying that आपके घर में कौन-कौन है? She says बेटे हैं, बहू हैं, बहुत प्यार से सब रहते हैं. And he's like, अच्छा कभी गुस्सा आता है. And these are ways by which sometimes homeopathy in the first session tries to get a sense कि आपकी फितरत क्या है ना? So he's asking these questions, and then he says आप हमेशा से यहाँ रहते थे. And she replies by saying that नहीं हम सिंध में रहते थे. And he replies by saying अच्छा. I mean, to this Gujarati, Sindh didn't mean anything. It's not a word that meant anything to him. And he asked, he said, so यहाँ कब आए? So she said, जब हिंदुस्तान पाकिस्तान हुआ. Right? This is how my community describes partition. And I like to think of this question, Hindustan, Pakistan hua in two ways. One is जब हिंदुस्तान और पाकिस्तान दो वतन हुए, या फिर जब हिंदुस्तान पाकिस्तान बन गया. Right? So whichever way, she said जब हिंदुस्तान पाकिस्तान हुआ. So then this homeopath is asking, अच्छा 1947 में. She looked at him with puzzlement and she said, साल तो नहीं पता. And I was a very young, starting out kind of a student scholar. And it sort of stayed with me, this response. And it seemed to me that how do you go through a history, but then you don't know the dates? And when I actually began to work on this project, I realized that men went through history differently. That men were involved in the nitty-gritty of planning and sometimes saying, हाँ असी जहाज़ में आया सी, I'm just saying in Sindhi now, असी जहाज़ में आया सी, पॉसी मोड़े में आया सी, like जैसे हम लोग इस तरह से जहाज़ में आए, फिर ट्रेन में आए, फिर हमने ये किया, फिर हमको लगा कि अभी निकलना चाहिए. मैं बंटवारे की बात कर रही हूँ. And the women very often would talk about other things, in the sense that they would also talk about leaving, but they would talk about how, you know, the neighbors were saying this, it was hard to leave, or so the affect was different, yes. So this question about whether our responses to history are gendered, right, is a question that has stayed with me all along. That along with this question are, of course, there are questions of class as well, right? So if you are, for instance, a very kind of, some of the members of my community that you would have seen who seem to you to be quite sort of educated, sophisticated, and it might seem to you what is Rita Kothari talking about. Look at, they are the what are called the amils of Sindhi community, which means it is a particular subgroup which has been quite sort of westernized. और आमिल उसको कहा जाता है जो अमल करता है. So जो हुक्मों के अमल करते हैं, people who are in the bureaucracy, and who went through a certain English education, very much like the caste in Uttar Pradesh. So that community you will find them sometimes in bureaucracy and in certain situations. A majority of the rest of the community were shopkeepers, mercantile people, and so on and so forth. And I belong to that. Now, so when you think of questions of gender along with class, then also the dimensions of history will change, right? So for instance, if you had if your husband had some kind of a job in Karachi, after partition he would have been given a commensurate important position in Delhi or in Bombay and so on. But that has not been true of everybody. In examining these responses, I was quite interested not only in the women who undergo the history of partition, which is not to say that as a witness generation, I did not have anything to do with partition. But in my generation, it was very interesting that women were also responding to the patriarchal nature of the Sindhi community in very, very sort of specific ways. So some of us, for instance, moved away from the community. I was recently at the Hyderabad Literature Festival where there was a special focus on Sindhi. And there were 6 women who work on, in varying degrees, from academic to journalistic to quasi-academic work. And all of them have married outside the community. And this also came up in the ethnographic work. And somebody actually said to me, a very young student, something that Nivedita Menon then quoted in her book when she wrote about Seeing Like a Feminist. So this young student, Vidya Tiwari, she said to me that, how is marriage both the beginning and end of everything? She said, when I tell my mother I want to do this or do that, and she said, shadi na ho gaye, shadi ke baad. And then she said, and when some people talk about, I don't do this anymore, so meri shadi thi gayi hai. Meri shadi ho chuki hai. And she says, I don't understand this paradox that how can this be the beginning, both the beginning and the end of. These are questions that have come up in my previous work in The Burden of Refuge, which is entirely based upon the post-partition diaspora of the Sindhi community. Sometime in 2007, I actually came to know of a writer in the border of Gujarat. Someone said to me there is a writer who Anchalik Navalkathaएं लिखता है. And it was very interesting because the post-partition Sindhi community is entirely urban. Right? Their literature is also very urban. When somebody mentions to you that, this person writes about rural nature of Sindh. Now really Sindh is in Pakistan. And then somebody said he's very much like Maradi Sindhiya, like he's a rural Sindhi. And people were talking about this writer. So I go to that region, especially to meet this writer. And I go and meet him, and we get to know each other. And it's a region that clearly is contiguous with Harpaka region of Pakistan. If you look at southern Sindh and you look at, Nirona, Banni, that northern part of Kutch, they are contiguous places. So people from those places would take a shortcut and go to Sindh without realizing that these are border crossings and so on. And in fact, that notion about border crossings is very recent because the international boundary along that region was promulgated in the 1970s. So tab tak to oont wagera bhi leke log chale jate the. And so this writer met me, and I realized that this is so interesting. He writes in Sindhi, he's a Sindhi writer, but occupation, he's a pastoralist, right? He's a cattle breeder. In that entire region, he's the only quote-unquote literate person. And first writer, so to speak, in a region that's imbued by oral tradition. Another significant moment happened that day. I mentioned to you one significant moment when I took my aunt and she said, "Saal to mujhe yaad nahi hai," right? Which is to go through history but not know that. Another very important moment happened, which is that field work not only is gendered, in the sense the spaces you can go to, the people you can talk to, the access you have or you don't have, but it also very often constructs you in a gendered manner. This writer read out to me a story. And the story is that, the famous earthquake happened in Kutch in 2001. And the story said it happened because women have become very free. They watch television and therefore this is God's revenge upon the region. I heard that story and I was not comfortable, but obviously I wasn't going to say anything. So I kept quiet and I thought, okay, this is interesting. And then I kept quiet, and then after a while he was talking about someone else. So I said to him, Bha, as in brother, I said, Bha, how do I go to this place? How do you think I should? And he said to me, he said, Tanta Dada forward aayo. He said in Sindhi, कि आप तो बहुत forward हो, आप मुश्किल होगी. It wasn't meant, it didn't sound like a compliment, right? It wasn't. And this word forward, the way he said it in Sindhi, was an immediate, it felt like an assault, right? And I heard it, and obviously once again I wasn't going to say anything. What is the point? Am I going to push back? I mean, teamwork is also about negotiation, right? And I have lived with in-laws. I have learned the art of negotiation in very difficult situations. And I know कि जब काम निकल पाना होता है तब छोटी-छोटी चीजों में वक्त जाया नहीं करते. हाँ, and I knew that यहाँ से मुझे काम निकालना है. So field work is also very much like negotiation. It is like navigation. And so I sort of ignored it, but I never forgot that. I never forgot the way that those words were articulated, almost with, and it's a strange combination of some resentment, some admiration, but very much constructing you in a gendered sort of a manner. Be that as it may, I make a few visits to Bali. I get to know the region a little bit. At some point I decide that I want to stay here for a longer time and I want to begin my field. Now Bali is literally the edge of the border. Right? And maybe some kind of slides we can start looking at, and then I will sort of read out to you. So this is one of the, Bali has over 24 different communities who define, they are all Sunni Muslim communities, who define themselves by a certain kind of tribal, clannish name that in India are unfamiliar. So for instance, Mutwa, Raisi Pota, Hale Pota, Sama, Sumra, Nodha. You will not hear these except in Kutch and in Dharwaka region of Sindh. Each of these will have its distinct embroidery. In each of these, the women would be wearing what is called kanjri, which is a certain kind of kurta made of that embroidery, which she would have embroidered herself until she got married and brought it with her. The entire, what is considered as Kutchi embroidery, its finest specimen is in this region. All of it is done quietly at home. You will not see these women anywhere. You will not see them outside home. As somebody who was doing field work in that region, my entire entry into that region, my understanding, my introduction to its various aspects was entirely through men. And meeting the women was like this prize you would not get until you had spent so much time and you were trusted to be taken inside the home. It took forever and ever for that to happen. What you did was, you met different kinds of men in the बैठक of their house. और हमारे यहाँ जो बैठक है, जो मेल बैठक होती है, उसको हम सिंध में हम ओताक कहते हैं. And so the talk that I will give you, it says beyond the otak, which means when I managed to traverse the otak, and went inside the quarters of where the women are. So before I begin the talk, I think I'll just quickly run through the photographs. This particular photograph is in one of the very poorer communities. There are many communities, some are slightly well-to-do, some are not. This is a very poor one called Pathan. They are called Pathans. Now, whether this Pathan has the same with Pathans as we know in UP, Delhi, I'm not very sure. I don't think it is. Right? And the community is called Jhararwadi. Let's go to the next one. These are just some children of that. I will not have any photographs of women because they were not allowed to be photographed. They did not want them and nobody else wanted them, so I do not have any. But little children did not mind. So these are children of Jhararwadi, one of the small hamlets of Bali. Let's go further. This is Mutwa embroidery, and I will be talking about Mutwa women. Mutwa is one of the more prestigious clan identities in this region, and they make the finest embroidery. And this is very prestigious, this particular Mutwa embroidery. So I will talk about the women from this particular clan. Let's go further. Just to give you an idea, can you see ये हम सिंधी में इसे कचहरी कहते हैं, जिस एक तरह से बैठक होती है और बैठक में सिर्फ मर्द होते हैं. Can you see? And this is how they would. You see them wearing ajrak, and right, and you see them wearing those stoles. A lot of affection, lot of warmth, but you cannot. You can't enter. Yeah. And let's go further. This is just a general scene from Kutch as you enter. Right? These are also Malgaris that are. So you'll find Rabari, you'll find Jat, and you will be able to identify people from the colors and from the embroidery. और अब आप जैसे कच्छ में enter करते हो तो जो आपको background दिख रहा है सूखा सूखा सा रेगिस्तान जैसा, that is what Kutch is. Let's go further. This is just me at the time when they trusted me and asked me to wear their clothes. You can see I was much younger. I think that's it. Okay, we can shut this. Thank you so much. Yeah. All right. Allow me then to kind of give the more formal talk I wanted to give today. So I call this traversing the otak. Just reminding you once again, I already talked about otak as in a male baithak in the Sindhi language. Silence is a distinct language women speak, and it has registers that cannot be reduced to a single meaning of submission or subversion. In the valorization of voice as a physical manifestation of women's agency, we often tend to not notice the manyness of voices inherent in silence. Women's silences, just as their invisibilities, may mean more than one thing or different things at different times. This is one of the themes in the talk that follows, built upon long-standing fieldwork in the state of Gujarat in India. Prefacing fieldwork from 2000 to 2006 with Sindhi-speaking Hindu women who migrated from Sindh to India during the partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947. It moves to a fieldwork-related narratives from 2008 to 2013 by Sindhi-speaking Muslim and Dalit women in a border region called Bani, situated at the Indo-Pak boundary near northern Kutch, Gujarat. The observations stem from efforts to listen, understand, and contextualize narratives, an act of translation, but not without the linguistic process of moving from a marginal language such as Sindhi to English. The discussion also hopes to complicate the idea of access in fieldwork, which assumes two extreme positions of possession and non-possession. Access granted is not the same as access guaranteed, so that women may have better access to other women than men, and yet not enough. This also brings us back to the half-revealed, half-hidden part of stories. When the province of Sindh went in its entirety to Pakistan in 1947, the Hindu minority that constituted approximately 25% of its population began crossing the newly formed border to live in the independent new Indian Republic. The move was not complete in the sense that a trickle of Hindu Sindhis continued to move in smaller groups in mediated but also the resettlement generation that had vivid memories of the partition. Women from urban and rural, rich and poor families formed a part. It was found that through women's narratives, we learn more about the patriarchal and feudal aspects of Sindh than the historical and political events of partition. This is not to say that women do not have a sense of history, but that they were not involved, as I said earlier, in the nitty-gritty of logistical details. They have participated in Hindustan, Pakistan, without very often knowing the month and year. Their narrative does not provide the details of living and traveling which become central to the men's experience. Women were not the ones deciding or implementing decisions. Very significantly, women did not see themselves as individuals undergoing the partition experience. They would frequently make use of the plural of the pronoun we. Saying, हाँ हम कह रहे थे, हमको कहा गया कि यहाँ जाना है, हमने ये किया. It was very interesting. The men would say I, the women would say we in their narratives, showing an intertwining of individual lives and collective lives. However, possibilities of translation. In the extreme west of India, where North Kutch touches the border of Pakistan in a region called Bani, which is very often missing from the map, situated in a corner of the hyper-industrialized state known for its aggressive nationalist politics, Bani is quite an oddity. People entirely were Muslims, save small sections of Dalits and another underprivileged group called Wada. Bani has no upper caste Hindus. Since 2011, one of its villages has emerged as a site for an annual desert festival. Extended fieldwork in Bani, carried out over 5 to 6 years and focusing upon its pastoral communities, sense of self and community, shifting ideologies of religion and responses to forms of regional and global changes constituted the crux of my research. The discussion draws from that larger study, hence this talk is called Memories and Movements, because this is the book that it led to. I call this section Ideologies of Invisibilizing. It is absolutely possible to go to Bani and not see any of its women. Secluded in and confined to their homes, women go out rarely and almost always accompanied by men. Meeting women there can happen only in two ways. Either they come out of the house and you happen to see them as passers-by or in shops, buying or selling things. The second possibility is that men take you home to meet the women of the family. Both possibilities shrink in the face of a general norm in the entire region by which women are simply expected to stay away from any contact with strangers, especially men, and very often women too. Therefore, visitors are made to sit in an otak, an exclusively male domain, in the form of the first bunga. A bunga is like a conical shaped mud-baked house, which you will find all over Kutch. As you enter, and then a community-based neighborhood in that region is called Wand. So each patriarch has its own Wand. Uska apna kabila hota hai. So you say Isa Bhai ni Wand, which means Isa Bhai ka pura jo kabila hai. Tea or meals are served in the otak, and the ones serving are the younger men of the family. So you will not see women, right? They are not serving you. On very rare occasions, a woman visitor may be allowed to go behind the otak, accompanied and watched by the men. The title of this essay, Beyond the Otak, invokes the spatial authority of the otak, the male or main room in the Bani household, which was to be traversed to reach the women in the interior part of the Wand. The narratives that emerge out of those spaces are extremely complex, hinting at simultaneous processes of continuities and discontinuities, submission to ideologies of male control, accompanied by a desire for change. In his travels to Sindh in the 19th century, author B. Cranton Carey discovered that there was reluctance among pastoralist men in rural Sindh to admit to another man that women could read and write. He says every girl in Sindh, except among the least educated classes, learns to read the Quran and also the Noor-Nama, a book describing the Prophet and the saints, written in ancient Sindhi by Abul Hasan of Thatta, but this without learning to write. Writing is still considered a dangerous accomplishment for women. And even today, Bani is very much like that. The three contexts of Sindh, pastoralism and Islam in the sociology that Brenton Carey refers to is also the sociology of Bani, notwithstanding the century dividing the two. It is not being suggested that there is a seamless continuity from one to the other, but to draw attention to studies that document the role of Sindh as a society that sustained for centuries structures of patriarchy, a matter far from peculiar to Sindh alone. In her research on Sindhis in Jakarta, Hong Kong and Manila, Anita Thappan notes that among women of the Sindhi diaspora, attempts to transgress gender roles are few because Sindhi women have internalized the patriarchal system predominant in Sindh and they tend to conform to its norms. The women who form Thappan's assessment are the well-heeled upper-class Hindu women whose families spread themselves far and wide as part of a long-standing global mercantile network amongst the Sindhi Hindus. Physically away from a traditional and feudal Sindh, cushioned with economic privilege and social opportunities of meeting other cultures, they represent one end of the spectrum. Muslims, rural, poor, isolated from other societies and discourses, and confined to their homes, the women of Bani represent another end of the spectrum. Somewhere between the two are urban, middle, and upper-class Hindu Sindhi women who, as I discussed elsewhere, find the gender norms in their community unjust and constricting, leading them in many cases to a degree of disaffection with all things Sindhi. So one of the experiences would be young women whom I would interview, and this was my own story as well. If I told them that, if someone thinks you don't look like a Sindhi, what do you feel? She'd say, I'm very happy, Professor. I've also discussed the social economy of Sindh that may have contributed to severe gender inequalities which continue to be perpetuated even today, despite many outward signs of affluence and vernacular westernization. Having said that, it is the complex web formed through demography, religion, class and patriarchy that makes Bani's women invisible and that needs to be delineated and underlined. Zaida Mutwa, name change, lives in the village of Gorewali. She is one among 40 members of what is called Musa Jivand, right? I mentioned to you what, or Musa's enclave. Musa Mutwa is her father, the patriarch of the family. His wife, 3 children and parents, his younger brother and his wife with their 3 children live together. Between them they share a kitchen and 3 bungas. However, a small threshold divides this entire group from the family that Isa's wife hails from, which again forms a large unit of 20 members with sons and daughters, brothers and their wives, and their children, adding up to what looks like a clan of people when you visit Musa's house. It's easy to lose sight of Zaida. When I first met her, she was a 12-year-old girl studying in grade 6. The school is right next to our house, she told me. I do padai and bhanai there. And padai is Quran ki padai. Bhanai is the formal study, which they had to do in Gujarati, and which is they couldn't relate to Gujarati at all. So they would study the Quran. Uski tafsir Sindhi mein hoti, which is why they were comfortable. So she said, I do padai and bhanai there, thereby referring to the fact that her Quranic education as well as school education took place in the same compound. She had learned some Sindhi, some Arabic, and a smattering of Urdu and Gujarati. How much are you going to study? I had asked her when she was 12. I had my answer on my last visit. Zaida had turned 15, quit school, and was about to get married. She would continue to live in the same ward, except move one house away, since she would be marrying someone from amongst the same clan and house next door. This is exactly what her mother and grandmother did. The indistinguishability of one generation of women from another in Bani manifests in few outward ways, such as clothing. Zaida would wear synthetic frocks and shalwars because she said, this is fashion in Pakistan. The older women wear embroidered kanjari. Kanjari is, I don't know whether you saw in that photo of fully embroidered, yeah. The older women wear kanjari and heavy silver jewelry. In terms of education and marriages and even possibilities of physical movement outside the home, the difference is marginal, if not non-existent. In a population of over 15,000 in the region of Bani, only one girl in its entire history has studied up to standard 10. A local newspaper found this newsworthy, and I was proudly shown the clipping by the girl's father, considered to be perhaps the most progressive man in Bani. Is she likely to study further? I had asked, to which I was told, no, there are no higher education schools in Bani and no lady teacher to teach, so it's out of question. Although it is difficult to say where patriarchal rationalization begins with what is understood as Sindh and ends or tapers into the idea of Islam, the rhetoric is worth examination. For instance, Hashim Halipota, back from his travels to Mirpur Khas in Sindh, says, we see culture in its purest form in Sindh. The same hospitality, the same Sufi music and poetry and everyday life. What about women, I ask? There is no difference in the way women live here and there. It is part of Sindhi culture to safeguard women's honor. To maintain this sameness, as is the case with many other things, a part of what we discuss as asli shafkat. It helps Bani reinforce its connection with Sindh. The implication is that Bani is derivation of that original and it needs to approximate Sindh as much as possible. It is in that understanding of Sindhi shafkat or tehzeeb that women in Bani follow specific norms of behavior. Deviation from such norms have not been heard of, and if differences do exist in the way women live, they have largely to do with class. Intertwined with this ideology is also the vocabulary, which again is derived from Asli Shafkat. The practice of women secluded among Sindhi Muslims is that women cannot be allowed gairat. It is explained as the need to keep women away from outsiderness, the gaze or the proximity of an outsider, and also make them abstain from things that would pollute their purity and respectability. The twin terms employed to suggest this is through two interrelated terms, gairat and parhez. The noun gairat has a Perso-Arabic origin and it's more common to use it is as in the adjective gair, meaning someone else or not your own. To commit gairat is to have contact with an outsider, a situation perceived as an unreligious one. The word parhez, they'll say, sir, parezi kutumba. You know, कि हम ये parez रखते हैं. We don't meet people there. And so on. I'll skip a few sections because if you know it'll take too much time. So this, I look at terms, the Sindhi words, that in that particular region manage to sustain an idea of respectability, purity, and an idea of borders. And I think one of my arguments has also been what are the different borders in this border region, right? ये ओटाक से अंदर जाना भी वो एक border है. कितने तरह की Delhis है. So there is the Delhis of the international boundary, and you will find the border security force there. Then you also have the Delhis by which what is considered to be Ashraf and non-Ashraf vocabulary has been made into a certain kind of a boundary. This region has a very big tradition of Sufi thought and ideology. You know, Nishad earlier mentioned that I'm translating Shah Abdul Latif's poetry, his bed from Sindhi to Hindi. Shah Abdul Latif, वहाँ की पूरी जो region, गरीब से गरीब, in fact खास तौर से गरीब, everybody would know him. Like he is a part of people's, you know, memory all the time. And it is very interesting that over the past few years, there has been an attempt to kind of purify the region of these Sufi influences, right? And therefore talk more about a slightly more Ashraf and so on. So एक अहले हदीस की जो influence से कुछ border making जो हो रहा है इस region में, उसके बारे में भी I talk a lot, but I don't want to do it today because it's probably not relevant to us right now. So I will kind of skip those parts here and yeah. Papanek remarks, so you know, the women are not visible to us. In some sense, they are in parda. But parda shabd, parda jo alfaz hai, wo aapko wahan sunai nahi dega. It's not a part of the vocabulary. Right? And women don't do parda either. It's not as if they cover their faces or anything like that. It's just that they are home. Right? And so I kind of complicate this idea of the parda a little bit, and it can be concluded so far that invoking Sindh gives far more legitimacy and weight to the ideas of Gairat and Pares, although it also finds support in the patriarchal interpretation of Islam that the men may have unconsciously forged. The differences between the Sunni Muslims and what they term as Hadith walas, or more tellingly, JK Firiwaya. You know, people refer to each other, those who follow the Hadith and those who don't. They have nicknames for each other. So, though they said JK Firiwaya are basically people who have changed, right? Then sometimes they will have metaphors of milk. They say JK Firiwaya. जैसे दूध फट गया ना, दूध खराब हो गया. This is a pastoral community, right? So when they want to refer to a change they don't like, their metaphors will come from milk, and like the milk has curdled. So they will say, हाँ they ये वाले या वो वाले इधर ही करते हैं because fickle है, you know, they have become different and so on. I want to come to the part where, which I think is my favorite part, which is beyond the otak, right? Going to the women, and it's quite interesting. When I was given an entry into that part of the house, and all the women of the ward, the young, the middle, the older, they would all come to see me, right? And all of them, 20, 30 women, would suddenly come around me, and they had a lot to say about many things. So they would say, there was some scorn because I wasn't wearing any. Then of course there was so much judgment because I left my daughter and I'm here hanging out with men and doing this research. And then at some point my husband would sometimes come on them. So then they were very happy. That okay, they are. And I think my husband is, I think he deserves it, but I think he's one of the rare men who was brought quite close actually to the women's quarters by Isa Bhai. But Isa Bhai would announce his arrival and the fact that there's someone there by doing what we call khonkaro. You know, he'll call. So then the women would all turn with their backs there, and Isa Bhai said, okay, you know, yeah, over here are the, yeah. So it took quite a while, and I want to kind of, and some of the women here are some of the finest embroiderers in the world. They have received awards from presidents and so on for embroidery, right? I call this section Asakhe Khaso Na Lage. This is a very touchy Sindhi way of speaking, and I want to talk a little bit about this. Nazneen, again name changed, had worn a synthetic green frock and shalwar, introducing her to me proudly as the newlywed bride. Her mother-in-law said, look at her, isn't she pretty? A host of women waited to see my reaction and verdict. The moment Musa linked me to the quarters, a privilege I acquired after we had known each other for some time, and after he had visited me in my house in Ahmedabad, his wife, his brother's wife, nieces, daughters, daughters-in-law, all came to that room. The room gets filled with all kinds of conversations that do not find completion because someone or the other is constantly saying something or offering tea, because, you know, and asking the usual question, "Diya kinawati आई है? हर दफे अकेले होती है अच्छी." Or the older Fufi, Musa's aunt, who would disapprovingly remark, "Kaisa kapda paega hai na? Icha baat hote." So, just very good clothes, they would tell me, because there's no embroidery of the kind they had. Nazneen watched with amusement. She was indeed a radiant, newlywed young woman with large earrings and henna on her hands. So, which village are you from, Nazneen? Fulai, she replied. While she married into one family, another girl from the same family was married to Nazneen's brother, thereby keeping up the endogamous tradition of exchange, or what is called in Kutch, Badobharan. Nazneen had embroidered her wedding quilt and brought her clothes in a tiny bag that lay in the corner of a bunga. Using that as an excuse, she had brought me to her bunga. She wanted me to see her books in the bag. She held out a collection of stories and anecdotes about the life of Batayo Fakir, a popular folk figure from Sindh. She asked me if I had pictures of my house or my daughter. Have you travelled to Ahmedabad? She laughed. Not even Bhuj. I have been getting headaches, so I will now be able to go and see a doctor in Bhuj. This was clearly her only legitimate reason for going out. I was to find out during my next visit that her mother-in-law had stopped allowing her to make continuous visits to the doctor. It's only a headache. Our women don't go out and meet other men. We are after all a parading family. Once she's pregnant, everything will be fine. Navni is only a year older than the 15-year-old Rita. So this goes on. I get introduced to somebody who has been awarded by the president for her embroidery and so on. And I asked her that, she said, so I asked her when did the award take place. She said I was taken to Delhi. And so I said, where did you stay in Delhi? So she said, yaad ko na kuch log nahi. She couldn't remember. So I said I asked her in Sindhi, I said, so when you were there, did you feel like, did you go to other places? And she said to me, and this is something I've never forgotten, which is why I think so much of actually understanding gender is about understanding language. It is about unraveling language. She said, Asa ke khaso na lage. Asa is hum. Asa ke khaso na lage. Khaso is acha. हमको इसका दो मतलब होते हैं. हमको अच्छा नहीं लगता, हम पे अच्छा नहीं लगता. ये दोनों मतलब इस चीज. She said ऐसा के खास मतलब, this idea of like हम वहाँ किसी चीज के लिए गए, फिर हम घूमने ऐसे टहलने चले जाएं, कुछ और देखाएं, हमको ये अच्छा नहीं लगता या हम पे ये सुहाता नहीं है. And I left it at that. I think this ambiguity, the fact that I don't understand which of the two meanings it is, I think it's a good thing. Because why I think field work should not be about smoothing and about translating and about making it fully legible to us because it makes life easy for me. If I come away from that field never knowing for sure whether Asake Khaso Nalage meant to be agential or whether it meant to be something else, I think just as well. Because what kind of hubris is it for a field researcher to go away thinking, I've got it all. You understand? Yeah, that I can interpret it. And that is where I think my being a translator is deployed for me as an important ethic of field work, as an important question in field work. And this is not only in relation to gender. For instance, there is another community, very tiny, called Wada. And for the longest time, I would not be able to figure out कि वादा जिसको बोलते हैं इसका ये बोलते कौन है. In the sense, लोगों के जो ये भूंगे हैं, उनमें जो लकड़ी का काम किया होता, like lacquer work, रंग-बिरंगी lacquer work किया होता. In Sindhi, we would say for a carpenter, we would say वादुआ. But I wasn't sure whether they are Hindus or Muslims, whether they are scheduled caste, scheduled tribe. At some point I asked myself this question, then why do I want to find out? Where am I going with this? Because it is the most disenfranchised community, and when I would go to their house, there would be someone called Salman, and there would be another brother called Bodabai. And I did not know, so I asked one of the Vadas, I said, Tata, again, I Hindu Jiran, Musulman Jiran, so who are you? And he said to me, he said, yeah, I know it is very bad. He said, yeah, very kharab gala. And he said, एक तरफ होना चाहिए, हमको एक तरफा होना चाहिए था. And I felt so ashamed of myself when he said that. He said, after, people, educated people like you, you're right, हमको एक तरफा होना चाहिए. And I'm thinking, we talk about post-colonial hybridity and celebrate, if you like, and when we are actually encountering it, we are not comfortable. Right? Which means we want hybridity of a certain kind. We don't want hybridity of all kinds. And so it's a separate chapter in the book, but I think what I'm trying to say is that even there the question was whether a field worker aligns with the dominant categories of the state and translates experience. Whether this act of translation, which aims to make everything smooth, is one of the big challenges of field work. And I think the idea that सब कुछ मेरे बस की बात नहीं है, मैं हर चीज का मैं तर्जुमा कर सकती हूँ. To know कि मैं नहीं कर पाऊंगी हर चीज is a good lesson to take away from. And so this particular question, Asake Khaso Nalage, or even the example of the Vada stayed with me. I want to come now to what I call beyond the otak, embroidery, agency, and exploitation. And I will not have probably too much time. But one of the arguments that I actually make is that when I say that women are invisible to us, I think I turn around at some point in this chapter and ask this question whether we are invisible to them, and whether whose need is it. So one of the ways I think to understand gender in this region and to realize that women are noticing is actually to see that through the embroidery. So anything facile by which we think that there is no distinction between Zaida Mutwa's life and her grandmother's life will take a toss if we were to see the embroidery. क्योंकि जाहिदा की embroidery में आपको कहीं पे computer भी दिखेगा, right? So then I began to again ask myself this question because I am constantly a student of language. I began to ask myself this question that for me change, what are the signposts of change? As to when do I think that change has occurred? And I think we are socialized into thinking that there has to be only the signpost of change. So अगर धागों में फर्क आता है through generation, एक नस्ल से दूसरी नस्ल तक, तो वो भी तो एक चेंज है, कुछ हुआ है. If you उनकी एम्ब्रॉयडरी की तस्वुर में if you are able to see कि कुछ अलग डिजाइन आए हैं, कहीं तो कुछ हुआ है, कुछ पता चला है, कहीं से कुछ कहानी आई है, कुछ लोगों ने देखा है, right? So although the girls were not allowed to see any films, and I have a chapter called bypassing television. टीवी नहीं होती लोगों के घरों में, ओताक में होती है, where the men are, और उसपे चादर लगी होती है, right? And so the women are not watching it. So I asked someone, I asked Sabina, I said, Shahrukh Khan ne देखा? So she said, no. Now I don't know whether she actually hadn't seen it or not. But I began to think that, but their embroidery is showing that something is registered, some new images are happening. There is a new design. And I thought maybe my understanding of change and movement needs to sort of account for the fact that there are more sides than the ones as urban women we are kind of socialized into. So I will simply come to the, how are we doing with time? You're so polite to take out there.
Very engaging for you.
Okay. Yeah. Embroidery in Bani is passed down from generation to generation. In the afternoons when women are done with a series of chores, cooking, which is usually on firewood, cleaning, drawing milk out of the cattle, giving the cattle fodder, they huddle over their respective quilts and kanjaris. Sometimes they embroider on the same cloth, 2 or 3 people approaching the fabric from different ends. Those are also the moments when they tell stories, share jokes, teach and advise the young, relay stories about men's short-temperedness, or intermittently break for namaz. What gets produced out of these gendered interactions, away from most eyes except the ones belonging to the family, is what is hailed as Bani embroidery, an authentic emblem and mark of the region. It is characterized by a pattern density and an integration of ground and surfaces. Bani women share preferences for 7 colors, satrani, color combinations, motifs, designs, scales and materials that reflect their shared landscape and economies, as well as an Islam-inspired aesthetic that not only proscribes representational motives but encourages a densely patterned surface. The networks of memories, words, threads and identities woven into this interaction are perhaps inscribed in the embroidery, evident in a little stitch that a younger woman may wish to do differently from the older woman. However, in the ultimate and eventual tapestry, little differences get subsumed by a familiar, albeit exquisitely characteristic look of Bani embroidery. I suggest that this is symptomatic of yet another paradox we encounter in Bani. Embroidery, argues Judy Frater, is a direct written expression of the experience of the impact of cultural and historical influences and an understanding at a deeper level of the actual processes of change. Based on the embroidery produced by the Rabari women, Judith later traces the historical changes of this originally camel breeding pastoral nomadic group over Western India. Patterns of movement as well as sedentarization, distinction from and assimilation into other contact groups get inscribed into their embroidery, making it a rich textualities of community histories. It tells the story of women's lives, their dowries, adolescence, marriages, youth, and widowhood, registering life stages as well as larger stories of borders between nations. Embroidery also tells the story of the pastoralists of Bani as also other nomadic groups and the web of movements in their history. As nomadic societies in the past, they survived by adapting to nature and in turn submitting to and resisting the imperatives of sedentary populations in whose proximity they lived. Bani pastoralists in particular received a huge setback when pastures common to both Sindh and Kutch became inaccessible. Simultaneously, the desert salinity made the topography inhospitable for their cattle. As cattle breeding got reduced to cattle grazing and mere subsistence, women's embroidery emerged in the period after the 1970s as one of the sources of livelihood. From personal and domestic consumption, it was adapted to needs of a commodifying culture. If embroidery responded to historic shifts, it was also a historical text by itself. Its threads, motifs, colors, designs, and relationship with women's bodies deepens our knowledge of Bani, and especially its women, who reinvent traditions by their relationship with it. In the period after partition, the people of Bani lost access not only to grazing lands, but also certain textiles they had traditionally used for embroidery. The increasing use of machine-woven cloth, dyed with chemical dyes, replaced the silk dupatta of Sindh. Michel Hardy notes how the Mutwas, arguably the finest embroiders, adapted their designs to new waves of migration into Kutch, as well as censorship of old movements. The influx of the Soda Rajputs, who after the Indo-Pak War of 1979, or the new shift from regional subculture to transnational Islamic reforms also found an expression in the embroidery of the region, and so on. I think I want to kind of, and then I sort of saw a whole detail on the market economy of embroidery and what does that do for the women. It enables them to get some money from which they may buy a gold bangle, they may get a bathroom maid. Does that enable them to do anything else or not? It's really an open question. I do not see that at the moment, but who's to know what will happen in the future? There must be also a fair amount of exploitation. That, for instance, there is something called Shrujan, which is a very big store in Kutch, run by someone called Chandra and Shaw, and I find it extremely low, the kind of prices that organization gives to the women of Bani for the work that they do. I go into these questions, but maybe today is not the time for me to. So let me just come to the end of the. This talk has invoked the speciality by which any approach to women is mediated by men. It took some time to earn the privilege of entering the women's quarters, and the privilege was granted by the men. One of the easiest things was to be able to communicate, since I shared the language the women spoke. The presence of some Kutchi in their Sindhi or some Gujarati and Persian in mine got bypassed. However, this shared context of language, usually perceived to be facilitating easy access, must not be overestimated. It also meant my being able to understand not only what women said, but also what they didn't say. In some of the Mutwa and Raisipota families that believe in guarding the women's terrain more steadfastly, this was a disadvantage. I would be listening to conversations among women when they would suddenly realize that I might have noticed more that they wished to share with me. So in fact, sometimes actually it was easier for white women to go into the quarters than it was for me. You know, because they knew that I was picking up a lot. As a translator, the questions became particularly frequent. Did I have the freedom to translate what was not meant for me? Or do I render half-said things, sentences trailing off to avoid finality about views that they had and could not conceive? This situation brought to mind Michel Hardy, an anthropologist, who mentioned that she worked with women because it was culturally appropriate. On the other hand, I got to know Bunny through its men, who became my principal informants, friends, and also, unfortunately, gatekeepers in my meetings with women. They interpreted the women's world for me rather summarily. My desire to meet the women had to be couched in social terms. This is ironic considering that as a woman researcher, I ought to have had direct access to women. However, there were two things that worked against this: the nature of my questions about Bunny's nationhood, its relationship with the state, its internal geography and culture, and the pastoral life of its people. This did not necessitate my interacting with a particular family, but a mix of people from different communities. In the process, I suspect, I got slotted as their men folks' friend, and also an Indian woman who understood their language, both verbally and non-verbally. My impression found validation when I read Harding mentioning in her thesis that her principal informant Khadija had told her that had she been an Indian woman, or had she wanted to go off with men all the time, she would not have allowed Harding to stay with her for more than a few days. The first year was characterized by this impasse. However, I gradually became a woman to the women, as one who had a family and whom some people from Bunny had visited. I traversed the Otak only when the women had also traversed it mentally to come into my life and seen there was a Sindhi woman here, different in class and religion, but one they had become comfortable with. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rita, for this absolutely brilliant talk. And all of us were so rapt, by your description of Bali community and Bali women and your interaction with these women. You began by saying that the fieldwork is determined by the inquiries you bring to it, and also that fieldwork is gendered and constructed in gendered ways. And the way you have narrated the lives of Bali women is really proves the point. Your experience of fieldwork and the way you have engaged with the work of Bali women, it also underlines the urgent need for feminist movements in India to engage with diversality, because we tend to take Indian women as a kind of monolith, but there are so many layers to it, so many nuances to it that we need to pay attention to. And it also alerts us to how language and gender are intertwined. We often tend to ignore this. This morning I was talking about Sidney Mint's idea of theoretically inconvenient zones, and when we talk about Bali women, we become alert to this theoretically inconvenient zones because we are so used to pushing things into Western, categories. So thank you so much. I was just looking at the introduction to the book written by Urvashi Butaria, and Urvashi Butaria says, remarkably free of jargon and yet deeply informed by theory, this is a biography of land and its people that enfolds within it many key issues. And I think this is the key point that we need to learn from Rita. We often, when we engage with theory, we use so many jargons, especially I'm addressing students. You can still write, free from jargon and theoretically informed writing. So thank you so much, Rita, and I'm so